Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's video, which we're going through a quick tournament report to a sort of casual tournament I went to recently, played a few games with a few different lists and just sort of talk through how they went and how the matchups played out. So yeah, went to, as I say, a very casual tournament recently with just a group of us got together, played 3 games. I made the mistake of taking a different list for each game, which meant I didn't really get a grasp of any of them, but um, did have some thoughts about sort of the different models I used and how the games went. So I'll just talk through those. Yeah, and we'll go through game by game. So for the first one, this is the list I took. It was Leia Wicket, Luke, and a bunch of Rebel Troopers with the Ion Gun, some Slingers, Sleeper Cell, and some Pathfinders. A lot of these units are kind of like the core of what I build my lists around these days. Like I think Leia Wicket's a super good combination. I think the Rebel Troopers with the Ion Gun are actually really good. Luke, after his points decrease, is also really decent. I mean, he was fine before, but now he's even better. Big Ewok Slingers, big fan of. Sleeper Cell, obviously really good, and Pathfinders are always a solid inclusion. So the idea of this list, bit of a gun line, and then you've got Luke, Wicket to act as your sort of linebackers, big squad of Ewok Slingers to hang around to tag some objectives, and then you're hoping Sleeper Cell will have the opportunity to blow some units away. As you can probably see from this picture, I was up against Gar. This was the new version of Gar, possibly the future. This was Cody and a tank, 2 ARC squads, and a bunch of core. I think it might be 3 ARC squads, actually, maybe 2. And some core, big squad with a shotgun, and then some smaller squads with the heavy weapon. And yeah, in this one, we vetoed through, ended up with Recover the Research, Surface Scan, and Advanced Intel. For this one, I didn't think was too bad a matchup. Like I thought I had in terms of range firepower, I had a bit more going on, and I had obviously more scary melee threats than my opponent did. Unfortunately, though, I made a complete mess of deployment, and this was a bit frustrating reflecting on it later. I basically chucked a couple of units over on the left-hand side to hopefully try and draw some deployments out, but then made the mistake of not grouping up the rest of my stuff more tightly on the right, which basically ended up with gradually he stuck his force together really well, made that nice clone ball. Cody pinked off a few nice shots, and the Arcs with their Scout 2, Move 2, and Shoot blew away a bunch of the Slingers. Forgot to say he also had Bad Batch. I knew there was something I was forgetting. Yeah, Bad Batch. The Gar Bad Batch I've never used, but I've come against them a couple of times now, and they are super scary. Like a bit of a different beast to the Rebel Bad Batch, in the sense the Rebel Bad Batch much more about objectives and sticking around. This one's actually a bit of a force with that Pierce and high velocity coming from. Can't remember his name, but I've never used him, so who cares? In terms of how this game played out, initially I think I was a bunch of VPs down and then gradually came back into it. Sleeper Cell did their thing, blew away a couple of squads. Luke and Wicket worked really well together. I think having force push, it's a tricky debate as to whether or not you should still stick with force push. Personally, I think it's sometimes correct, but it does depend on whether or not you have other melee units. I think, for instance, if you're bringing a squad of fleets that can dig one of your ranged units out of melee, perhaps maybe you don't need force push. But I think there are definitely cases if you're imagining Luke's going to be by himself trying to push things around, it's not a bad thing to have at all. But 40 points is a lot to throw at it. So yeah, 6-8 loss. I think our forces were fairly evenly matched, and while I definitely did make mistakes, I think my opponent just played really solidly and was able to sort of gradually whittle through my guys. And yeah, I just didn't have the staying power to stick with it really. So yeah, not mad at the loss, but yeah, a few mistakes in there for sure. Game 2. So this put me into the 0-1 bracket, which is always an interesting place to be. This was again this time again another completely different list, very different ideas to the previous one. This was Hero Hammer, so this was Cassian, Han, Chewie, K2, Luke, Fleets, Rebels, and the AA5. In this one, I dropped Cassian as an operative, so 4 operatives, 1 commander, which actually is surprisingly good in terms of order control. It has weaknesses in other areas, but surprisingly good in terms of order control. So yeah, this one was up against Shadow Collective, which is always a nice thing to come up against these days. Triple Mandos, Gar Saxon, and then 2 Black Suns and 2 Pikes. So not super high activation army, and like while it does have some pretty scary hitting power in those Black Suns and to a lesser extent the Mandos, it was an interesting matchup to play out against. So basically, in this army, I put Cassian and K2 on one side, Han and Chewie on the other side, and then Luke kind of up the middle to be able to react to whatever came out. I had a medical droid on the fleet that dropped with Cassian, and then I also had an astromech, which I forgot I had on the board and didn't put with K2. Yeah, this one was really interesting. It's definitely not a good list. It has some severe weaknesses, but there were some heroes that performed better than I expected. So for this one, we were on shifting priorities, which is always fun. Big fan of shifting priorities. Mark targets, again, like I think it was a fairly happy one that we both vetoed through, and advanced intel, which probably still the best advantage in the game and was super nice to have early on because I think I was an activation down in this one, so I actually ended up with the 11 activation, same as my opponent, effectively with that pass token. But yeah, in terms of how this played out, Han did virtually nothing this game. He was just plinking off Mandos, which was really frustrating, like just bouncing off those surging red saves. Luke was really nice to have around. Like, again, he's just so good at locking up objectives by himself. And I think, while I'm not the biggest fan of burst of speed, having burst of speed gives you some good options here. Han and Chewie are fine. Like, Han is just so board dependent. Like, if you can get some decent line of sight blocking. So in this picture, for instance, I was on the right hand side of the board and my opponent was on the left hand side of the board as we look at it. I think if it'd been the other way around and Han was able to hide behind that big building on that right hand side and be able to pop out, shoot, and then pop back in every turn, I think it would have been a very different game. But because on this side, unfortunately, he didn't have access to any really useful line of sight blocking near the center, it did mean he wasn't as useful as I was hoping. Chewie just crumbles so quickly. Like, he effectively never saves. Like, maybe he'll save 1 or 2 if you're lucky, but yeah, like the 9 HP is not really enough, and you can use him to Guardian once or twice on Han. In all fairness, his charge attack with tenacity and that lethal and offensive push and stuff is surprisingly good, but it's kind of one and done thing, and then he just dies. Cassian and K2 as a combination, I think K2 is now almost unusable in the game. There's cool shenanigans you can do with, what's it called? With Incognito. But after that, 5 surging white just isn't good enough anymore. Like, maybe he puts off 3 PS1 if he's got an aim. Brilliant, and then you just get shot and killed. Like, it's just not good enough anymore. Cassian, on the other hand, before I used him in this game, I'd seen a couple of people online saying that he was essentially unusable. I think Cassian is now really interesting. I think he's not good yet, but I think with buffs hopefully coming in the near future to some Rebel characters, his 3-pip's still really solid for me. Like, if you can get it off on 2 units that want to recover, Luke and Ahsoka are the ones that spring to mind. I'm probably going to do a list building video soon where I talk about that. It's really good value, and like, especially now because the game is shorter, having that recover on one of your turns just becomes that bit more valuable because there's less time for sort of the setup and things like that, and that recover does have more impact on those sort of big melee turns. So surprisingly good with Cassian. The other thing that Cassian benefits from is, especially on a map like Shifting Priorities or even Breakthrough, where you do kind of almost want one unit perhaps sitting back to be tagging an objective or something, he can be really useful. And like, his infinite range sniper with a red and a black, high velocity, and pierce is surprisingly good. And especially if you can aim shoot, generally you're hitting probably 2 hits with that aim. Well, you'd be very unlucky not to hit 2 hits with that aim, but a hit and a crit isn't out the question as well. And like, with the way cover works now, it's probably going to be 2 PS1, and that's with no dodges. So I think it's interesting. I don't think he's good right now, but I think give him time, and perhaps there might be a list that he can slot into fairly soon. The other thing that I tried for a while, but brought here, was the AA5. The AA5 here has had some really interesting bits of value. With the way Unorthodox Tactician works now, because it triggers off the board, if you can trigger it early enough, and especially with the units I had here with Teamwork, you can get a surprising number of aims out there. And if you do have units that are going to be shooting turn 1, like for instance Cassian, having that aim ready to go can be really nice. Medic is fine. I think there's also an argument for Gonk. It depends if you want your AA5 to live or not, right? Like, if you want it to survive, you take Gonk. If you're not that fussed and you don't mind it dying like turn 3 or turn 4, then you can probably take the medic and get a couple of nice heals off. I personally always go for Shriv, giving that extra dodge every turn as a free action is really nice. And I think, again, in a list we'll see later, combos really well with Layer and Wicket. And then the hardpoint upgrades like are both really interesting now. I think the 12-point range 4 rainbow gun is slightly better just because critical 1 is a really useful keyword to have over perhaps impact. And I think while impact is great, you don't want the AA5 to be going toe to toe with other armor, so that inherently perhaps has less synergy. So I think take the rainbow gun, probably take an orthodox tactician and Shriv as like the basis, and then maybe choose between the medic and the gong. Game 3. I got a bit screwed on my greens here. Got rid of both of my advanced intel and cunning deployment. So was left with ordnance, which is fine. Like it gave out some suppression, which was fine. This was shifting priorities again. I really enjoy shifting priorities every time I played it, and destroy enemy base, which will come in, not clutch, the opposite of clutch later. But yeah, hadn't played Destroy Enemy Base for a while and made a big error in this game. So this one is kind of the closest to what I thought was like a traditionally good Rebel list currently. So Leia Wicket, IG Luke, a couple of Rebel Troopers, Fleets with Scattergun, Sleeper Cells, Slingers, Pathfinders, and a Trupp. Yeah, this one you chuck out Leia and Wicket's 2-pip turn 1, and then you kind of go from there. I think IG is really interesting now. His range 4, and if you're taking the bounty on a commander, PS1, otherwise it's suppressive if you take it on an operative. But just being able to throw out, on average, with his gunslinger, it's 2 lots of 2 PS1 is roughly the average. Is just really useful, and like again, similar to Cassian, I think is perhaps a little bit undervalued because with a lot of the list, and I especially found this in the second game that I played, you end up with kind of this above critical mass of stuff that needs to go early in the turn. So, for instance, going back to the list in game 2, like you kind of want hand to be going quite early or really late. Those are kind of where you want your hand to go. But then you also want, for instance, Luke to be going fairly early. Probably, if you've revealed K2, you want him to go in quite early. If you want the fleets to be going, like, and there's all these things that you reach this kind of critical mass of needing to go quite early in the turn. And I know people's response will be that you should plan for that and stuff like that. But I think what you need in a list currently, and this isn't exactly revolutionary, but you need a balance of things that can go early in the turn and a balance of things that can go late in the turn. And the reason why I think IG is so good is that he doesn't need an order. He can go whenever the hell he wants to in a turn. And as long as there are 2 things at range 4 that aren't in combat, he will be able to shoot them. And if not, he can always move shoot. So I think he's really useful. Occasionally watch out for that AI. Like it doesn't go off super often, and hopefully he should be in range of Leia. But yeah, that is just something to be aware of. Should be noted, I made an error in the screenshot here. I didn't take underworld connections. I think I just didn't take anything in that slot, and then I put 5 points somewhere else. But yeah, didn't take underworld connections in this list. Again, I thought the AA5 was really decent in this list. The combination, especially with Leia and Wicket, because they have that teamwork, chucking 1 dodge on Leia gives another to Wicket, and so on and so on. Like, it is just a really nice thing to have. And I think what I hadn't realised, because I hadn't used the AA5 for a while, is having that turn 1 before you move onto the board, chucking out those aims to units that want them is really useful. Like giving an aim to IG effectively gives you like an extra hit at some point, for instance, and things like that. Like it really is surprisingly good. But yeah, this game was quite an interesting one. With shifting, I kind of spread out quite well. We both put our base tokens in either corner, so you can just see there. Mine's in the bottom right, and my opponent put theirs in the top left. And basically, sorry, I should have said what my opponent was playing. My opponent was playing a very similar list to me. His was Leia, Wicket, Bad Batch, Luke, and then a bunch of core and an ATRT Flamer. 2 sleeper cells as well, because I think a couple of sleeper cells might be the future. Personally, I think just 1, but I can see the argument for 2. And yeah, so Bad Batch popped in on the right-hand side, and fortunately, I was able to chip them down pretty quickly thanks to a combination of some IG shots, a few shots from the AA5, and some plink damage from my Rebel Troopers. Yeah, I think the Pathfinder and IG combination going together is really nice because it lets you manage things at range 4. They can both also handle themselves at range 3. And it does just mean you sort of shoot and then slowly back away is kind of how I tend to play them. Unfortunately, I didn't back away quick enough with the Rebel Pathfinders and they were blown away on this game. Luke again dropped on the sort of left-hand side and then made his way towards the centre. There was a turn, Luke was my bomb carrier, where he could have jumped in and nobody was protecting my opponent's base and I could have blown it up and got 4 points. I forgot Luke had the bomb and I didn't do that, and that probably cost me the game here. Yeah, I don't know. I think this final list is probably the one that I would consider the most consistent. I think there's an interesting debate as to whether or not you want the AA5 in this list, because the problem is with the AA5 is with the buffing stuff, especially, you kind of want it to be going fairly early in the turn. And at least with this list, in comparison to the previous list we've looked at, that isn't such a bad thing, because if you can get those aims and those dodges, and then even if you just move standby, like the shenanigans you can pull off with the AA5 and blocking line of sight and like sectioning off areas of the board is in some ways more valuable than shooting. Like, I don't think you always have to shoot with the AA5, even if you take the hardpoint upgrade. Like, you've thrown 12 points, maybe you kill a model or two early on, but then just moving and standbying and things like that is really useful. And if they do kill it, it's going to take quite a lot of time, because that armor 5 is normally enough to get rid of most dice pulls, apart from Sleep Cell, who can just blow straight over the top of a lot of armor and things like that. But yeah, that was a pretty random and whistle-stop tour through the 3 games I played. In terms of the lists I took, I think the first list, the sort of Luke Gunline list, has some interesting ideas, but I don't think the Rebel Troopers can quite hold up to the kind of dice pools that are being thrown down. I think another problem that is, again, quite obvious, but you don't really realise until you use the Rebel Troopers, is they feel great on turn 1 because you've double moved in into your heavy cover normally with 2 dodges, and like, even if they get shot, they're shrugging off a lot of it, and that feels really good. Turn after that, though, they have no dodges to start the turn with, and unless you're getting one with Layer and Exemplar and things like that, they then have 0 defensive tech. So while that agile change has really helped Rebel Troopers, it only helps them if they're able to go before they are shot. So I think part of the reason, and in future I will be bringing them back in, why Pikes are still have a niche and are still quite useful, is they get that independent dodge. So they don't need to perform any actions, they're just already there. And then they have that danger sense to go with it as well. And while it might not sound like a big deal, that can just be enough to perhaps keep them alive for an additional action compared to when the Rebel Troopers might die. So it does sound like quite a small difference, but it can really add up. In terms of the other core option, fleets, I think fleets are fine. I think you shouldn't take more than 2. I think 1 personally for me is fine. The way I'll tend to use them is sometimes I put a medic on them, nearly always take the scattergun because I think it's super useful. And generally what you want to do is put them around the corner behind some line of sight blocking, pop out, and then try and deal some damage. That charge is quite nice, quite useful. But again, they have even less defensive tech than the Rebel Troopers, so if they are being shot first, they're just going to die. Sleeper Cell are like Fleet Troopers, but better. They have the same issues. If they get shot first, they're going to die. You're going to lose so much value. But if they are able to shoot first, 14 Surging Black with a couple of aims is normally enough to blow away most units in this game, and it can even insta-kill Force users if you're lucky. For instance, they killed the AT-RT in 1 shot here, straight through the armor, over the top, too much damage. Other units worth noting, Ewok Slingers I think are fantastic, really cheap, great filler activation. Don't expect them to kill a lot, but if you need a unit to just sit on an objective, fantastic. Rebel Pathfinders, they're great. They will die if you leave them slightly too far forward, as happened in this game. Bad Batch just ran forward and insta-killed them, but they do a surprising amount of work, and with Bistan especially, getting that critical 1, if you're shooting armor, if you're shooting a bit of cover and stuff, is really nice. And don't be afraid to use them at range 4. It is definitely tempting to move into range 3 to get those extra dice, but it's worth remembering that those 4 white dice normally only cost you a hit, and it's sometimes worth it to be at range 4 and force your opponent to come to you, rather than moving into that range 3 and then letting them shoot you back, as it were, because a lot of stuff is now range 2 only and doesn't have that range 3 option. So camping out range 4 where you know you can't be shot back has a lot of value. As I said earlier, I think Luke's still a really good option, and I think is now with that 10-point reduction. I personally prefer him to Bad Batch. I think before it was very close, but I think now that 10-point reduction has confirmed to me that I prefer what Luke does. I think Rebel Bad Batch are interesting, and I think they are really good for objectives, but don't expect them to kill a lot of stuff. And I think that's more of an issue than perhaps you realize initially. They can kind of hold stuff off, but they're not actually dealing much damage back. So unless you're doing the sort of Han approach of, jump out, take a steady shot, jump back, which I think is fine, but it just won't kill that much stuff. So it's maybe less effective. But then the ideal situation, right, is you're able, there's line of sight blocking within range 1, so you jump out, do some damage, and then you're still able to tag the objective behind line of sight blocking. And in that situation, I will admit, they're absolutely fantastic. Wicket and Leia are the best Rebel commanders right now, and they get even better because they have such good synergy with each other. Yeah, there's not much else to say on that. I think there is news of a rework coming, and I think that'll be really healthy because currently I think almost any Rebel list gets worse if you choose a different commander to Leia and Wicket. You can have Leia by herself. I think that's okay. And I think actually there are some ways of running Leia, perhaps with, Han, or I'm going to argue for Cassian. Come on to that in another video. But I think Leia is probably the choice over Wicket right now. But Leia and Wicket together is a fantastic combination, and they cover each other's weaknesses really nicely. So yeah, if you are looking for a base to build a really good inverted commas, one of the best Rebel lists, I think starting with Leia and Wicket is a really good way to go. But yeah, hope you enjoyed that. It's slightly random, just like a bit of a ramble, but yeah, had a really good day. Played a decent variety of lists: one Gar, one Shadow Collective, one Rebels, and yeah, lost more than I won, but it happens sometimes. And I think I did really enjoy running 3 different lists, even if it was a bit mentally taxing. And yeah, learned a lot, and some units really surprised me. And one takeaway I would have is if you haven't given Cassian or IG a go, give them a go and just see how they feel, because I think they might surprise you in terms of like what they're able to get done in game. But yeah, like and subscribe, and see you for the next one.